Hello everyone. In this module, you're going to learn how to set up a strategy to reduce your company's greenhouse gas emissions, what we call a decarbonization strategy. But first, we need to go back to the Paris Agreement. In 2015, at the 21st Conference of the Parties, that's why we call it COP21, 195 countries gathered in Paris and agreed to set up an objective to contain global warming to well below 2 degrees compared to the pre-industrial levels by 2100. Within this framework, each company has a responsibility to contribute as best and as quickly as possible. And this goes through the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So we'll first start with the first step of a decarbonization strategy, measuring your emissions. Now, why should you measure your emissions? Because it'll help you pinpoint where your greenhouse emissions are coming from, so that you can be sure to focus your efforts where the bulk of the work lies. So pick a given period, usually 1 year, and perimeters, the sites, facilities, activities, or products covered. What we measure here is the carbon footprint, the amount of carbon dioxide released in the atmosphere from your activities. When we talk about carbon footprint, we're really talking about measuring all your greenhouse emissions, not just CO2. So for instance, this includes methane, nitrous oxide gases. You can assess your carbon footprint at different levels. At the product level, you'll measure the emissions along the life cycle of your product. At the company level, your carbon footprint can be measured on 3 main parts that we call scope, which is defined by international standards and methods. We're going to explain all this to you. Scope 1. It's the direct emissions coming from your company's activities or under its control. The combustion of fuel on site, such as boilers, vehicles, leaks, etc. For a company in heavy industry, this is typically the most consuming scope. Scope 2. It covers the indirect energy-related emissions of your business. This includes all the emissions generated upfront by the energy your company consumes in the form of electricity, steam, heating, or cooling, for example. So, where does this energy come from? If the electricity you consume comes from low-carbon sources, that could be renewables or nuclear energy, your carbon footprint on Scope 2 will be smaller than if the electricity is generated by coal-fired power plants. And finally, Scope 3. It includes all other indirect emissions, upstream and downstream of your activities. For example, if you have raw materials delivered by truck by a supplier, this activity generates emissions. But this scope also includes emissions generated by your employees driving to the office. You can decide if you want your assessment to cover all 3 scopes or just scopes 1 and 2, for example. Depending on the sector, the emissions allocation among these scopes can differ quite a lot. But note that emissions related to supply chains, that is Scope 3, often account for the largest share of a company's emissions. So including Scope 3 can be key to efficiently reducing your emissions. You can see that these scopes cover a wide spectrum. Now the good news is that there are methods available to help you measure your emissions. Available regulatory frameworks, the International Standards Organization, the GHG Protocol, or the French Bilan Carbone. Also, you don't have to do it alone. There are many providers that can help you measure your carbon footprint. In the next video, we'll see how to set targets to reduce your emissions. Hello everyone. Now that you've measured your carbon footprint, let's see how to set a target and reduce your emissions. To assist you in your efforts, United Nations and partner organizations have launched an initiative called Science-Based Targets that helps you to define a path to reduce emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. Remember, you will need to have all your companies supporting that goal to set a very clear objective with a date. So, you're setting up your decarbonization strategy. How and where do you start? The concrete actions you'll take will be aligned with your global decarbonization target. In your activities, that could mean reducing your energy consumption and switching to renewables and low-carbon energy sources to reduce your Scope 2 indirect emissions. There are many ways to do this, depending on the company. Here are a few examples. Reduce your energy consumption through energy-efficient measures or technologies on your sites and processes. Or install on-site renewable electricity generation. Or have a purchase of power agreement, a guarantee that you buy electricity from a renewable energy project. Apply the circular economy principles in your processes. This includes reusing as many materials, machines, and products as possible, reducing the amount of waste your activity generates, recycling waste materials for future production, and recovering wasted energy. For example, using heat recovery units to capture energy from machines. If you've measured the carbon footprint of a specific product, you can apply these principles to other products as well. For example, you can use materials generating fewer emissions and lasting longer. This innovation can give you a competitive edge. In fact, innovation and investment in R&D is another pillar of decarbonization. It can allow you to develop much more effective low-carbon technologies and strategies instead of making marginal improvements. In the cement industry, for example, substituting the traditional Portland cement with pozzolan cement could have the potential to reduce CO2 emissions by almost 70%. In your value chain, you can encourage your suppliers and your clients to opt for low-carbon sources of energy. Look for energy efficiencies in your supply chain. You may be able to cut back on transportation emissions. How long is your supply chain? How many sites? Where are they? Would it suit your reduction goals to consolidate operations? Or would several smaller sites closer to raw materials or to customers emit fewer greenhouse gases? And here's one quick win: limit empty transport flows whenever possible. You can also implement behavioral changes among your employees, adapt travel policies to limit the number of business flights, support riding a bike to work scheme to reduce your Scope 3. Consider the impact of your IT use. Can you extend the lifespan of your existing equipment, computers, phones? How about energy efficiency improvements for your office buildings? That's all for now. We'll see you in the next video to hear about carbon sinks and other efforts. Hi everyone, we've seen how to reduce your own carbon footprint. We haven't talked yet about carbon sequestration and about efforts outside your value chain. Let's see what you can do about that. You've probably heard of carbon sinks or carbon sequestration. Remember the Paris Agreement? To achieve its well below 2-degree temperature goal, we need to reach carbon neutrality for the planet by 2050. Carbon neutrality, that means we should not emit more greenhouse gases than we're able to absorb, either naturally or through technology. So to achieve this, we need to reduce our emissions and develop carbon sinks. Carbon sinks are entities that can absorb or store carbon. Nature provides some of the best: oceans, forests, terrestrial plants, soil. But technology can also be used to create carbon capture and storage facilities. These technologies are still in their infancy and need powerful backers. Companies can play a great role in this. Let's look at examples. You can develop carbon sinks or sequestration inside or outside your value chain. Obviously, prioritize those that are done inside first. So, inside your company. If your operations throw off concentrated effluents, direct carbon capture on-site's an option. A cement producer, for example, can develop a large-scale facility for carbon sequestration at its plant to capture significant amounts of CO2. Some companies can draw directly on naturally occurring carbon sinks. Perhaps your value chain includes suppliers in the agricultural sector. You can help them adapt conservation techniques to increase the soil's capacity to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Now, outside your value chain, you can finance carbon sinks by purchasing certified carbon sequestration projects. For example, purchase a certified project to restore a forest to prevent its deforestation, which will help store, or even in some cases absorb, a certain amount of CO2. Make sure to have sufficient information on their impacts, including social and environmental co-benefits. Choosing carbon removal projects that would not have been undertaken without your investment is essential. This is the concept of additionality. Otherwise, you're just wasting time and money without actually removing additional carbon from the atmosphere. You can do the same with carbon reduction projects by financing certified emission reduction projects outside your value chain. For example, financing a solar park as a substitute for a high carbon source of energy, which would not have been developed without your investment. There are several international standards to help you verify that your projects respect serious criteria. But remember, according to many international decarbonization actors, these offsets taking place outside your value chain should not be considered as an alternative to your own emissions reductions, but rather as an optional and additional financing effort. And there's a big task ahead of all of us. Human activity releases 51 billion tons of CO2 equivalent a year. So that's the starting point. Now we need to get down to close to zero climate neutrality. You want to know more? You'll find more practical tips in the next do and don'ts video. Do engage top management and the executive committee of your company in your decarbonization efforts, because these efforts should be part of your corporate governance. So, someone in top management should be piloting or following the decarbonization process. That might also mean additional executive training, maybe even pegging compensation to the climate change mitigation process. Do align your company's strategy with the Paris Agreement. As we mentioned before, the Paris Agreement sets out a goal to achieve a balance between human emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases. This is at the planet scale, not at the company by company level. It can be quite hard for a given company to know if their objectives are ambitious enough. That's why you might need external help to certify that your commitments are aligned with the Paris Agreement. Don't underestimate the means and resources it will take to implement and monitor your decarbonization strategy. Develop a detailed operational transition plan that includes a timeline, financial impacts, and key monitoring indicators. Do be transparent. Getting an independent assessment of your decarbonization strategy is key to ensure its strength and ambition. It's objective and it's useful for investors and clients. For that, it's important to provide enough information to the assessor and the way you intend to reduce your emissions. For example, if you're planning to purchase carbon offset credits, it's important to be able to provide information on the nature of these programs. Do collaborate with players from your value chain, the public sector, even your competitors. Remember, decarbonizing our global economy is a cooperative project. Partnerships with public actors, suppliers, clients, or competitors can support costly improvements and help scale up eco-friendly alternatives. For example, with housing insulation or low-carbon public transport. Shenzhen is the first city to fully electrify its fleet of 16,359 buses, saving 366,000 tons of coal annually. So think outside the box and work with players from your value chain for carbon reduction projects. For example, Apple announced a partnership with the aluminum producer Alcoa and the mining company Rio Tinto to develop zero-carbon aluminum. And competitors? They can be your best allies for sharing resources and knowledge to develop costly low-carbon technologies that you can both use and benefit from. When setting your emission reduction targets, it's important to know the difference between absolute and relative reductions. An absolute reduction objective is, for example, to produce 10 tons less CO2, or to reduce CO2 emissions by 30%. A relative objective is to emit half as much carbon per kilometer traveled in transportation, or per unit produced in manufacturing. Remember, the goal is to reduce your impact in absolute terms, because then you can be sure that you will reduce the amount of carbon you've been emitting. So even though your company may grow, your absolute level of emissions should decrease, not just your emissions as a percentage of revenue. With a relative target, the risk is always the rebound effect. The rebound effect? Well, that corresponds to an increase in overall carbon emissions despite your best efforts to do otherwise. So how does that happen? It's very simple. Imagine that a car company makes a more efficient engine that consumes less fuel and therefore emits less greenhouse gases. It becomes cheaper to drive, so people tend to use their cars more. Then more carbon will have been emitted, which is bad news. This sudden explosion in the consumption of a product that produces less pollution per unit is the rebound effect. Since this often happens outside your operations, it's difficult to control, but there are ways to offset it. For example, by increasing the durability of your products and anticipating it. Well, it's not that simple. First, we can't develop natural carbon sinks indefinitely. Think of forests, for example. There's a limited amount of land we can use before we start compromising our agricultural needs. Some companies use the concept of offsetting emissions outside their value chain as a means to achieve a target of carbon neutrality. But you need to be careful. Such offset efforts often have a much smaller impact in reducing your own emissions. In this context, an increasing number of decarbonization organizations, such as the Science Based Target, do not consider these offsets as equal to your own emissions reduction efforts, but rather as an option for companies beyond their science-based target. It's a technique used voluntarily by companies to include the cost to society of greenhouse gas emissions and help guide their reduction. This can take the form of a shadow price, a cost per ton of CO2 applied to your company's projects, investments, transactions. Low-carbon investment projects get a lower cost, while those with higher carbon get a higher cost. Projects in line with the low-carbon transition are therefore favored, even from a financial perspective. Another way to use carbon pricing is to create an internal carbon tax. The tax is usually applied on some carbon content of the company's operations, which is then applied to and collected in your overall operational costs. From that, you'll be able to know which entities in your operations emit the most emissions. The funds from the tax can then be used for decarbonization strategies of these entities.